Good afternoon, Janet.
Hi.
How are you? It's so good to see you here. Thanks for joining me on Michelle's Conversations That Matter.
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm very excited to talk to you today. I think that this is such an important topic for so many people. And I was thrilled to have met you and learned a little bit about you. And I think you're perfect for talking about this, really raising this conversation for people, because I think many of us are just sort of running into the ground, working our tails off, and we're not taking a moment to put our oxygen mask on. So I am very grateful for this conversation today. So before we dive into this topic, just a little bit about what I do with Michelle's Conversations That Matter. I started the series to elevate the conversation around mental health, to really help people get comfortable talking about the brain, inspire them, educate them. I have people on who are clinicians who educate us on different diagnoses. I have storytellers, people who have navigated mental illness and sort of represent the hope that it is possible to live a beautiful life and still have a diagnosis. And what I do professionally is I get to work with organizations to recenter their employees, to really help them have their employees feeling good, mentally, emotionally, staying engaged in their lives and in their work. So that's just a little bit about me and what I'm doing here. Could you take a moment, let our audience know who you are, where you live, and what you do for a living?
Sure. So I'm located in New York City, and I'm a human resources leader here. But as Michelle knows, my career did not begin in human resources. Instead, it was mental health. I earned 2 masters in psychology, and I was doing direct clinical work for a few years. But then I had the opportunity to move up into management and program leadership. So over the years, I not only gained experience in people and operations leadership, but also human resources and organizational development, strategic planning, change management. So my last in-house position was a startup, which I architected from the ground up, every aspect of it, and then I led it to success. And then the last 2 years, I have been doing human resources consulting with executives across the country, variety of human resources issues, in addition to coaching human resources professionals on preparing for the SHRM certification exams. So, right now, my professional passions are things like workplace culture, employee engagement, leadership development.
Amazing. That's great. And why do you care? Why was it that you gravitated immediately, do you think, you gravitated to the mental health profession?
Well, even as a young kid, people would just come to me and tell me things. And that is not only precious cargo that you're holding for people, but it's also a bit intoxicating. There is a little bit of, whether people want to admit it, a little bit of ego involved. And I seem to be good at it. So I wanted to be there, especially for kids. I started out working with troubled youth because I saw kids around me sexually abused, addicted to drugs, grappling with their parents' divorce. And I didn't feel as though the adults in their lives were really helping much. They may have been, but from a kid's perspective, I didn't feel that way. So I wanted to grow up and be one of those advocates.
Amazing. I love that. I think it's so important for us to understand why people start out in the careers they start out. It's like it's something pulls you toward it. So I always like people to know that. So we have been through quite the journey with COVID. It's been an amazing, what was it, like 14, 15 months where we all just were in such a different space. Emotionally, mentally, professionally, financially. There's so many issues that had surfaced. And so we've been through a lot. So, how does this classic airplane emergency instruction of put your oxygen mask on first really apply when it comes to the workplace these days?
Yeah. And, it's not just COVID, as if that weren't enough, right? It's navigating, remote workforce culture. And, we've also, unfortunately, in this country had a year of a lot of violence and diversity, equity, inclusion issues, unemployment, layoffs. There's just been so much. And stress and trauma really can take a serious toll on people. Physically, mentally, it can impact your personal life, your professional life. So that's why you and I had talked about, this topic, because we can't effectively help others if we are not taking care of ourselves?
Yes, exactly. So there's a lot of terms that have surfaced over recent months, more so. Burnout is something that we hear a lot of, but then we also have heard a lot about decision fatigue. And, I think about people who, like HR professionals, who've had to sort of, spin on a dime to sort of figure things out. What does return to work look like? How do we support our people? Are our policies backing what we want to do? So talk to us a little bit about what is decision fatigue and how do we manage that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's do you mandate vaccines? Do you not? Do you have people return to the office? Who are you downsizing? Who are you laying off? How do you implement an effective diversity, equity, inclusion policy that really means something, that you're really walking the walk, not just talking the talk in your workplace? So yeah, I mean, managers and leaders have always had to make lots of decisions, but you're right. It's sort of multiplied over the last year and a half. And these are like really weighty decisions. So if you think about the fact that people have only a certain amount of energy per day, right? Like that's like why we sleep at night. That's why we eat. We're kind of like a battery, and things throughout the day will draw upon our energy and drain our battery. And making decisions is one of those things that depletes us, particularly if we have to make a lot of decisions or they're complex or like high stakes decisions. I remember the first time I was ever a program director of a 24-hour residential facility, which if anyone has ever worked in residential, it's like unlike any other, work experience ever. And in this particular program, we were working with individuals who lived there who were mentally ill, had medical issues, substance using. So it was a 24-hour on-call operation where not only was I making business decisions and staff decisions, but I was dealing with life-threatening emergencies, reviving people who had OD'd and, suicide attempts and things like that. And I remember I would come home from work and my boyfriend at the time would say, hey, like, what do you want for dinner? And I truly could not answer that question. I was just so depleted, so wiped out. And listen, I love to eat. I love food. I always have an opinion about what I want for dinner. And I couldn't even answer such a simple question because I was so drained and fatigued.
Right.
I had no battery left.
Yeah. Yeah. So what can people do? So I think about how many people who are watching who are like, oh my gosh, that's me. That's the average day for me. So what can they do if they start to experience this decision fatigue?
There's any number of things that you can do because everyone is different. So what might work for one person might not for another. But I have 3 suggestions for our talk today. One is, as best as you can, I know it's easier said than done, try to prioritize the decisions that you have to make. Try to front load at the beginning of the day when you have more energy, the big decisions, the important decisions. And then if you can't figure out what you want to have for dinner later, like who cares, right? Another thing that you might want to try doing is simplifying the everyday decisions. So instead of waking up in the morning and boom, you have to make a decision about what to wear to work, plan your outfit the night before. And I know that sounds like really, really simple, but sometimes those little fixes add up, through the course of the day. Also, another similar thing could be like planning your week's, lunches ahead of time. So make like a huge thing of chili or whatever you're going to eat, on Sunday, and then like eat it, at the risk of getting sick of it, but like, plan your meals, throughout the day. And then the last thing that I'll throw out here is take breaks. And I know it's easier said than done, but like if you're working from home, walk the dog, check the mail, come back. Just even those 5 minutes will help you reset and refresh.
Really, really good, really important. Let's talk a little bit about this secondary and vicarious trauma. So what are the differences between trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma? That's a lot of trauma in one sentence.
Yes, yes.
What's the difference?
Triple trauma. So trauma itself is an emotional reaction that people have. It's a natural, understandable reaction to a situation that they perceive as either being physically or emotionally unsafe or even life-threatening. So like if you're a victim of a crime or you're in combat or you experience a natural disaster. So that's trauma, and that happens to you. Secondary trauma is an emotional reaction to trauma that happens to someone else. And it tends to be immediate and after even just one exposure. So an example is if we reflect for a moment back on George Floyd's murder. The witnesses who were there in person, I'm sure you've heard through the media and through interviews, they are experiencing terrible symptoms of trauma, some of them survivor's guilt. I mean, it's truly heartbreaking the impact that that horrific event had on them. And although they were not the ones, that were murdered, obviously, they have an emotional reaction to what they saw. But it's not even just the people who were there in person. Millions of people around the world watched that footage, and so many people also experienced a traumatic reaction to that, particularly those who themselves in the past had experienced prejudice and discrimination and aggression against them because of their race or brutality due to law enforcement. So that's secondary trauma. Now, vicarious trauma is a close cousin. And that is an accumulation of trauma that happens to other people over time. So a good example might be a rape crisis counselor who, after years of working with rape survivors, starts to internalize some of that trauma if they're not refilling their cup throughout.
Wow, that's so what is those are all very, very serious. But when we talk about this, why is that connected to people's workplace experiences? Because it is.
Yes. And because it happens so much more than one might think. And it's not just the rape crisis counselors. It's a defense attorney who maybe hears lots of stories of his clients who are crime victims, or an insurance adjuster who hears stories of people losing their homes. I mean, think about what just happened in Miami. All those poor people who, the ones who survived, have lost their housing. Or over the last year, there were lots of HR professionals and finance executives who had to make terrible choices as to who to let go, who to lay off, which programs to downsize. I mean, obviously that was traumatic for the people who lost their jobs, but it's also traumatic for leaders who care about their staff. Those are tough decisions. So it really happens a lot more than we might think.
What are the signs and symptoms to look for?
So, there's sort of three areas where they can show up. They can show up for the person, they can show up in their personal relationships, and then also in the workplace. So individually, it could be anything from anxiety, nightmares, anger, lack of pleasure, hopelessness, even self-injurious behavior or risky behavior, suicidality. In personal relationships, it might be shying away from physical and emotional intimacy, not enjoying activities that once were pleasurable, or not socializing as much as you might have in the past. And then at work, it could be conflict with coworkers. I mean, more than usual. Yeah. It could be making more errors, having difficulty concentrating, second guessing if what you're even doing has purpose. Mm-hmm. It really can negatively impact you in some profound ways. It can even make you sick, and cause absenteeism and lateness at work.
So what for employers out there, what can they do to prevent trauma in the workplace? And how can they support staff who they recognize who have experienced trauma?
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, Michelle, it starts with what I would hope that everyone would have to begin with, which is a healthy and positive, supportive workplace culture. Yes. And leaders set the tone with that. That begins and ends with leadership. It also has to do with leaders modeling self-care. And, offices have unwritten rules, right? So like it might be that your schedule is 9 to 5, but if you see all the leaders working until midnight, you don't really think that you can go home at 5. Right. So leaders have to walk the walk, and they have to make sure that staff truly have easy, ready access to support systems. So employee assistance programs, mental health services, whatever staff might need. It also is very important to make sure that line managers are effectively and regularly supervising their team. So not just saying like, hey, did you meet this deadline? Did you do this project? Did you get this done? But how are you doing? How can we be more supportive to you? Do you need any other training or resources? and managers knowing some signs of stress and trauma. Not that they're going to be mental health professionals, but just having a sense of what to look for in their team, because your people are your most valuable component of your business. And if you don't attend to these things, you will have a toxic workplace. You will have low employee engagement and retention. You won't be able to attract top talent, and your performance will suffer. So the business bottom line is also going to suffer, in addition to the employee experience.
So I know there are probably people watching who are saying to themselves, that's great and all, but we are entirely remote now. Cultures are now like, you can't even touch them because you're not in a room together. You don't see the values on the wall in the building when you walk in. So how do we do that? How do we keep the lines of communication open when we are so disconnected from that face-to-face interaction?
Right. And isn't that the $1 million question that every single company is asking?
Exactly.
It has to be authentic and regular communication. Studies have shown that when it comes to employee engagement, the only thing worse than having an abusive, toxic supervisor is having a hands-off, absent supervisor.
So true.
So, there's got to be regular communication and authentic, both in a group setting to try to foster, team development,
right,
and creativity as a team and cohesion. But that one-on-one time, and it doesn't have to be long. You don't have to talk, on the phone or on Zoom or whatever for 2 hours. It can be a 15-minute check-in. But when staff know that their leaders really, truly care about them, that is the foundation from which everything else, develops.
Yeah, when I think about mental health in the workplace, I think about like the trust, the rapport. Like if you want an employee to feel unashamed and I guess transparent about what they're dealing with, that trust has to be there. That foundation has to be there between the leader and the employee, and you can't manufacture that overnight. You can't just say, okay, something's wrong, so let me build trust. It's like an ongoing garden that needs to be tended.
Yes.
It takes effort, and it takes even more effort in a virtual space. Like I feel for that for sure.
Yes. And for leaders to be transparent and vulnerable, So, it's okay for leaders to say things like, I'm just not going to be able to do any morning meetings tomorrow. I've got to, take care of, my kids, or, my family member or whatever, the issue might be. And then, of course, to allow employees to do that as well. There needs to be flexibility. Some leaders, depending upon the work environment, might even, when they have a shared schedule with their staff, they might even show times where they're engaging in self-care, whether it's they block out time to exercise or engage in therapy or, a support group. And that's really being vulnerable. But then you really give an authentic message to your team that they should be doing that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you said it best when you said modeling. One of the things I'm always talking about, people say to me, I'm worried about my teen. I'm like, well, are you modeling good mental health self-care? Because they're watching you in terms of, they're watching you probably more than they're listening to you. So if you do what you say to do, it's powerful. So powerful.
Yes.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about a different type of fatigue, compassion fatigue. So what is compassion fatigue, and what are some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue?
Yeah. So it's very similar to decision fatigue, but this tends to show up for professionals in a number of different industries, not just, therapists and nurses and things we might think of, where it is your role to care for other people and to show empathy for other people, where you always have to be on and positive and professional and giving to others. So that might be retail workers or customer service representatives or human resources, leaders. And over time, particularly with everything that's gone on, over the last year and a half, you become depleted if you are not constantly refilling your cup. And you start to struggle with the ability to empathize with others. In my consulting and coaching, I have worked with a number of leaders who have confided in me that if they hear one more staff member who has to miss work because of COVID, or if they have to console one more person who has lost a loved one to COVID. Now, you might be saying, oh my God, who are these monsters that you're working with? But no, that's the thing.
Yeah.
One of the most heartbreaking things about compassion fatigue is that the person hates that about themselves. They want to be there for others. Otherwise, they wouldn't have chosen that profession.
Right.
They know they need to be there, but they are so drained physically and mentally. And sometimes they get themselves literally sick that they just cannot show up for others, And so, symptoms would be things like insomnia, apathy, negativity, just a loss of feeling like you have a purpose. And in your personal life, maybe also losing interest in intimacy because you can't even handle a romantic relationship or friendship on top of all your staff that you're taking care of. It's really, really draining.
So I think you have some tips on what we can all do to reduce the risk of developing compassion fatigue, especially people in your fields and beyond who might be listening. Like, what do we do? How do we prevent this?
Yeah. I think it comes back to what we were saying a little moment ago, which is that leaders have to model self-care and self-compassion. You and I were talking a couple of days ago, and I love that. You said self-compassion, and that's a wonderful way to put it. I think it's also important to be realistic about what you're asking of yourselves and of your workforce. In one of my roles, I spent a couple years, it was the startup. And if anyone's ever done startup, that it's a bit of an insane, venture. And for 2 years straight, I kid you not, I was working from 10 in the morning till about 1 in the morning. And that was just in office time. Then I was on my phone and everything, all other hours of the day. And, I started to get just a tad tired and a little burned out. And I realized I wasn't showing up as my best self for my team. And I wasn't going to last. I was going to get myself sick.
Right.
So I set an alarm on my phone and I labeled it "Step Away from the Desk." And I set it for 8 p.m. And still that was a 10-hour day minus a lunch. Meaning I wasn't even taking lunch. It was 10 solid hours a day. But I forced myself to step away from my desk because I started to realize that I wasn't going to be good for anyone else if I wasn't good for myself,
Right.
I think another thing that really saved me over the years with lots of stressful jobs and very dynamic settings is just talking with people, knowing you are not even close to being the only one who's experiencing this.
Yeah.
And the ability to talk with colleagues and friends who knew what I was going through. Some of them had similar jobs where I could be reminded that I'm human. I'm not handling this poorly. I'm handling it like a human.
Yeah. Yeah. We put this superhuman responsibility on our shoulders. It's kind of interesting how, we think we should be doing more and more, but you're right. The moment you're able to talk to someone who's in the same boat as you and you realize, oh man, they're swimming along like I am. It's the same thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing I was going to mention was, we don't get to show up as our best self when we're depleted. And you mentioned that, but I think it's worth mentioning. The title of this interview is Putting on Your Own Oxygen Mask. Doing that first. I think that's so important because we don't want to show up less than our best selves, because that's when we make mistakes. Yes. We damage relationships. We say things that we regret. And it's all about preserving our well-being so we get to show up to, and be the best version of ourselves. You agree?
Absolutely. And everyone, right, in any role should be doing that, because literally your physical and mental health is at stake. But in particular, leaders have a responsibility to walk the walk and model that for their teams. The teams need to know that it's okay that they have a work-life balance. That's not just a fad term. That's an essential. Study after study has shown that your team will not be as productive. They will not be as creative. They will not be as engaged if they are feeling beaten down.
Yeah.
And so it's just very important that we as leaders do all we can to prevent our workplace culture from becoming toxic and unhealthy.
It's so interesting. I was just, I was at a personal event last weekend, and I was talking to someone, and they were saying about how their employees, over the time period we've been home, working from home, that many of them have been much more productive, right? And so you think about the workday, we removed the commute in the morning, the commute in the evening. So people are working, they can work after dinner because the computer's already there. So this, the amount of work that people are actually doing is more than it was when they were working in the office. So it's a greater risk of burnout, right? Greater risk of all of these things. Do you have any thoughts on that, on how people can like really start to look at, if we are going to be working from home in some hybrid model until God knows when, like how do we prevent those types of things, the burnout, the compassion fatigue, all of the things, the decision fatigue? How do we do that in our homes and maintain balance?
Yeah, because you're right. You don't have that sort of hard stop. You don't have that commute to either decompress at the end of the day or to get your mind going at the beginning of the day. So I think that similar to sort of that alarm that I put on my phone, and that might sound hokey, but that's what worked for me. I think it's very important to do similar things. You need to start with what's truly important. No job is worth your health, your physical or your mental health. No job. That is the most important thing. And the second most important thing are your personal relationships with your friends and your family. So I would recommend first figuring out, what do you need to do in your schedule to safeguard those things? Do you need time to exercise? Do you need time to spend with your kids when they get home from school? You know, whatever it is that you need, then start to build around that your work time. That's where I would start. And I also would do everything you possibly can. Again, I know it's easier said than done, to get enough sleep, to eat, nutritiously. We are not robots. We need those things to keep going and sustain ourselves to be the best that we can be.
What came to mind when you were talking about that was the jar where you put the golf balls in first. Those are the big priorities into the jar. And then you put like the smaller other things into the jar. And then you fill the rest up with sand, and you get to remember what the big priorities are. And then everything else is adjusted around that. Do you remember that? Like, that whole idea with the jar?
I've actually not ever heard that before, but I love that. I have a great image in my head now.
Yeah, because then like the sand going in is like everything else, but you know what your priorities are, and that's where your energy goes. Yeah. I love that, because it's so easy to just be like the paper bag in the wind, just being like, I got to go over here. Now I got to go over here. Now I got to, and we we lose sight of like, oh my goodness, I didn't work out for a week. Oh, that's why I feel like crap. Or I haven't had a relationship with my child because I've been so busy. And then we have regret. And then that compounds not feeling good. So there's all these, it's like a vicious cycle.
Absolutely. And working longer doesn't mean working better.
Right.
Actually, to the contrary, it's been shown time and time again that if you can really compartmentalize and be like, okay, I've got to get this done in this amount of time, you actually tend to be more productive.
Right. Your back is up against the wall. So we've quickly come to the end of our time together. I can't believe it. So any final words of wisdom, anything you'd like to share, you want people to know, leaders, HR professionals, whoever's watching us today?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to just repeating just that it's absolutely crucial that you make sure that you engage in self-care, and that if you are a manager or a leader, that you demonstrate that and model that for others. I also just want to say that this was really quick and a very, very broad, overview. And so if you are identifying with experiencing any of these things, or if you know someone that you're concerned that they may be experiencing any of these things, please reach out, for support, whether that's your employee assistance program or a mental health professional or other type of support.
Amazing. Thank you. Spoken like a true clinician first, then HR leader second. So thank you so much. And thank you for your time. And it was wonderful to talk to you. And thanks for all the wisdom that you shared with everyone today, Janet.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All right. We'll be in touch. Talk to you soon.
Okay.